Welcome back to the shop, everyone. First video of the new year, but this one we are taking it back to week 45 of 2022, which is November 7th to November 13th. And let me tell you, I have something special in store for you. It's more wiring. So we're going to start off. I'm going to grab my wiring plate out of the car. I'm going to get ready to start working on it. So what I'm doing is I'm just taking the screws out of the terminal strip and I am laying the wires out and I'm cutting them to length. I'm setting up my crimper to make sure that I can crimp the right size. For that one, I'm just using regular crimpers. Don't know why. Maybe I just didn't feel like untaping it. Regular crimper works just fine. Regular stripper works just fine, that is. And there's my normal ratcheting crimper for the uninsulated terminals, and now I'm going to move that uncrimped terminal to the next one so I know exactly where to cut the wires, and I'm just going to keep doing this for all 8 of the inputs to the relay board. So what I just noticed is when I crimped that first wire, I pinched this orange wire, and the plastic casing is really deformed, and I'm actually quite frustrated with myself that I was just so careless. There's no excuse for it. But what I did is I grabbed my multimeter out and I pinned the wire I just made sure that the wire wasn't broken internally, something that I couldn't see, because that could have potentially catastrophic results. That's potentially going to be running my fuel pump or a coil or something like that. So I want to make sure that wire is not broken and doesn't have any issues. So as I go through this, as I strip the wires and I put the ends on the wire, I make sure that the terminals are all facing the same way. So on the terminal, there's like a flat backside, and then there's the bump where the wire goes. So all of this, the bump is facing down. I did that because if I had to put 2 terminals under one, the bottom one, the bump faces down, the top one, the bump faces up, and then you can squeeze 2 of these terminals under one screw. And you would have seen on my fuse panel wiring when I did the brown wire, I forget what it was for, but there was 2 wires going into there. So the first one faced down, the second one faced up, and that way it's very easy and very clean. Now that I have all of the relay board inputs terminated, it's time to wire in a main power wire. So that's where the fuse is going to sit, and then I'm just going to wire a piece of 4 gauge 90 degrees from that fuse onto the board. What I'm grabbing out there is a hydraulic crimper, and that's a fairly fairly large hydraulic crimper. It's kind of unwieldy, but it works. And all of those dies in that kit are metric, so 25 millimeter, 50 millimeter. But all of my work, I'm using like 4 gauge or 2 gauge lugs, so I just need to find the conversion from kind of the gauge system to metric, and I do find that. Got that little chart printed out. Yeah, so I'm just measuring the size of the caliper, or the size of the lug, to kind of make sure I have the best die selected. So I have what I think is the right die there, so we're going to start by stripping the wire down, and then we're going to crimp it. It's always easier to start short and then cut more down instead of going too long and then you gotta cut the wire. This wire isn't the cheapest stuff in the world, so I do my best not to waste it. So what I'm doing is I'm just getting the lug kind of situated in the crimper before I put the wire in. And I can pump it up a little bit just so that the lug is snugged in there and it's not moving before I actually get the wire in there, and then I can crimp it down fully. Well, I can try to crimp it down fully, but as you can see with the dies that I had, it did not crimp for crap. There was no holding pressure, nothing. So I'm throwing it in the smaller die, putting that lug in there, putting the wire in, and we're gonna crimp it down. We're gonna really crimp it down, and it's holding, so that's that's the main goal, is to have it hold. I wasn't able to pull it out, so hey, it worked. So we just tighten that down, and I'm getting figuring out which lug I need, and that's, I believe it's a quarter 4 gauge, so it's a quarter ring going to a 10 gauge lug. And so I've marked out how much cable I need, and get a nice little bend in there. I'm quite happy with that. I'm gonna cut the insulation off the wire and then just crimp this other end. So you can't really see in the video. I mean, you can kind of see, but when I did the first crimp with the bigger die and then the smaller die, the crimp worked super, super well. So when I did that second crimp with just the smaller die, there's these little like what I call wings on the crimp, and it's where the lug squishes out and then gets pinched between the dies, and it just looks like trash. I hate it so much. So, I always like to do my unboxings on video, because that way if anything's broken or anything like that, I have proof that, hey, I opened this as I got it. And today we have my Mazir 55 gallon per hour water pump. I'm just checking all the parts, checking all the pieces, making sure I've got everything. Yeah. Alright, Alright, now we're skipping over to wiring. So in one of the previous videos I had that connector that I broke. Well, at this point in time I've reached out to Maven Performance, who are just super awesome, and you know, I ordered a bunch of other stuff and they sent me this replacement half shell, and I'm gonna do my best not to fuck this one up like I did the last one. So as we can see, the 12 gauge wires, or what are those? Are those the 12s? No, I think those are 16 gauge wires. Either 16 or 14 gauge wires. They go in there just no problem. Just push them in like it's nothing. And same with the slightly bigger. I think that those are 18 gauge wires for the fuel pump or fuel injector power. And we're just gonna start feeding in the rest of these. Yeah, so I am fighting trying to get this wire into this connector, and you know, it's taking me just a lot of effort. The reason why is the pin has to push back the locking mechanism. So what I end up doing is grabbing the de-pinning tool and using that to get all of these pins in. I was a little gun shy to use the de-pinning tool to actually seat the pins because that's how I originally broke the first connector. I now realize that it broke because I twisted the de-pinning tool while I had it engaged, which is a big no-no. And now that I'm a little bit more cautious and a little bit more wise, I'm very careful while I'm going through this process on all of these wires. I don't want to break another connector. It seems like I am forever untangling wires when it comes to this build. So here I am again. I've got, you know, a few of the connections done, and I'm just gonna untangle some more wires because what else do I have to do with my time? Yeah, so that was a fairly long process getting all of those connected and done, but it is done and I'm happy that it's over. Now that all the wires are in place, let's get this connected into the car, and it goes in no problem. And I'm kind of questioning the placement of the connector at this point because of where I want all the wires to route. As you can see, it kind of jumps out, and then I'm going to have it kind of fold up and back because I want it all to go under the intake. I'm trying a couple of different ways, like what's the best way to make this look. I gotta deal with the fuel rail that's right there as well. I gotta keep that in mind. So there's just all these considerations, and at the end of the day, I think I just lived with it. So as you can see, I've got all of the wires from the engine bay inside the car, and what I'm doing right now is I'm just stripping, you know, 1/4 to 1/2 inch off the ends of each and every single one of them. And I am doing that so that I can test each wire end to end. So I'm gonna pull the connectors off the dominator, which doesn't even look like that's in the car. So that means that those connectors are just kind of hanging loose in the back of the car. But what I'm gonna do is I'm going to go through and test each and every single wire and make sure that the wire on the engine bay side lines up with the wire on the actual connector. And so I have no surprises when I go to, start this thing up. I know this is a long process. What I did is I just stripped a little bit of wire so that I can actually get it in the connector a bit better. The end that I have on my multimeter is just a little too big to fit in there. So with a piece of wire, I can clip it onto the end of the multimeter lead, and I can just, push it into the socket and check continuity. The reason why I'm doing this is I'm fairly confident in the work that I've done, but in case there's something wrong, maybe a broken wire, maybe I didn't seat one of the connectors fully, I just want to kind of check this before I get too far into it. So that's why I'm double checking this. I haven't done a ton of these. I'm really inexperienced. I want to make sure it works. And you know what? For the 5-10 minutes that it took me to check each one, for that peace of mind, I think it's worth it. As I said a little earlier, you know, I was fairly confident with my work. I didn't think I had any pins in the wrong place. I was very methodical when I built everything. And as it turns out, yeah, everything was just fine. I didn't run into any issues. There was no pins that were done in the wrong place. So in theory, all of the wiring for the engine bay should be good to get hooked up to all the end devices now. And now for something that I do quite often, procrastinate. You know, I'm just thinking, where do I run the wires? How do I do this? You see me do this a lot. I'm just procrastinating. I'm gonna, you know, start splitting out some of the wires just because it's something to do. I do know that some of these wires are going to be run together. Like, I know the crank and the cam trigger go to the same place. I know all of my IAC motor stuff go to the same place. But you know, reality is I'm just kind of killing time and also trying to figure out all of the wiring and how it's going to work. So, you know, as usual, I know where some of these things are going to go in the engine, and I want to make sure that when it comes out of that connector, that all of the wires route to the general area with, you know, the wires going to the front on the bottom, the wires coming closer to the front on the top, and I kind of pin the entire harness out that way. The harness doesn't know where the pins are, the wires don't know where the pins are, but it's just, for me, I like having that little bit of organization and cleanliness. So right now I'm just grabbing a few of the boxes and a few of the parts and pieces that I'm going to be using on the front end of this. So right now what I'm looking for is the bolts for the upper intake. I just want to make it so that it doesn't slide around as much as it is right now. And when I got into this hardware, I realized this is for the other intake that I had, the original one that came straight to the front. And the box that this side plenum came in is up on the shelf, so I just never grabbed it down. I just need to grab a couple, you know, bits just to make it so it stops sliding around. You know, attaching the plenum doesn't affect the wiring in any way, shape, or form. I just wanted it so that, you know, as I'm working in the engine bay, I don't accidentally knock it and, you know, it hits the ground and bends and breaks or anything like that. So that's why I'm just throwing 2 bolts just to kind of hold it in place. MAP sensor, or the manifold air pressure sensor. So it senses how much pressure is in the intake. So when you have a boosted application like I'm gonna have, you'll have, people will refer to it as, positive PSI or vacuum going the other way. So that'll just measure how much boost or PSI is in the intake. So I was having a hell of a time getting this MAP sensor installed. There's a little O-ring on there. That's a little plug that came with the intake. The plug goes in there, no problem. So I'm just measuring up the actual ports on them, and I think they were pretty much identical, other than the little O-ring on it. So just using a little bit of pressure just to get it in there. That there is the intake air temperature sensor, so that manages the temperature of all of the air in the manifold. So typically when you have boost, what it's doing is it's taking air and compressing it, which generates heat, which is going to increase the temperature in the intake. And so that little device is just going to measure it. All of the map and the intake air temperature, it's to tell the computer what's going on in the engine so that it can control how much fuel to put into it. Because how much fuel is going to change how fast it burns. If the air is hotter, maybe you don't need as much fuel. I'm not that smart when it comes to the inner workings of engine and the temperatures and what the engine's going to do as the intake air temperature rises, but that would be my thought. A hotter air is going to need less fuel to ignite and to burn hotter, but I'm not sure. I could be completely wrong about that. Don't take my word for it. So the next thing that we are going to do is get this pretty massive 105 millimeter throttle body just installed onto the intake. Yeah, so we're just using all of the supplied hardware that came with the intake to install it, or sorry, they came with the throttle body to install it onto the intake. Yeah, so looking at this, I'm not in love with the Holley EFI stickers on the intake and the throttle body, so I might look at getting rid of those somehow. I'm not sure if that would really work. Yeah, so I just grabbed some throttle body parts. So that right there is the idle air control motor. And so I believe what that's going to do is when the car is idling, it's going to open and let some air pass by and pass into the engine. Because in that throttle body, there's a blade. So when the blade is closed, that means that there's no air going in. So you need to have air entering the engine somehow just for it to idle. And that's what the idle air motor does. So what I found out is the bolts in this idle air motor do not line up with the throttle body. So I'm just taking some measurements of the actual idle air motor and then comparing it to the throttle body and just seeing, maybe can I just play with it a little bit and make it work. But at the end of the day, no. it's wrong. I don't know why I kept on messing with this so long. Obviously the bolt holes didn't line up, so it was wrong. Period, end of story. Like, why am I still messing around with it? Just kind of a waste of time, but also an experience. So I learned, if the part looks wrong, it probably is wrong. So, since it's wrong, we are just going to continue on installing stuff that is right. So this is the throttle position sensor. So this essentially connects to that blade that I was talking about and tells the computer how open or closed the blade is. And that blade is connected to the arm on the close side, that little silver part right on the end of the throttle body. So when you put your foot down and the throttle cable pulls that throttle bracket that the cable attaches to, it opens the blade. When the blade opens, it moves the throttle position sensor to tell the engine where your throttle's at. Alright, so what I'm doing here is I'm just running the wires through the intake. So that right there are the wires for the idle air control motor. I just used I think just a spare wire I had kicking around just to fish it through the intake. And now I am getting the wires that are going to the front of the motor together. So that's going to be my water pump wire, my crank and cam sensor wire, as well as the air conditioning compressor power wire. So with that, I can start kind of figuring out some of the sensor wires. There's the two sensors on the back. I've got a fuel pressure sensor, coolant temperature sensor, oil pressure sensor. I want to say that's it on the front of the engine here. So you can see that box says temp/pressure sensor. So what I have is a coolant temperature sensor and pressure transducer in one. And the reason why I have that is, as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to have a boosted application here. And when you're under boost, it's pretty common that you blow a head gasket. And when you do that, the pressure in your coolant system starts to rise. So I have a combo unit that is going to measure the temperature as well as if there is excess pressure in the coolant system. That way, if I'm running hard or just being an idiot out there, and the head gasket starts going and pressure starts building up in the coolant system, I can kind of get out of it and maybe save the engine. Fingers crossed, hopefully. So with that, let's jump into some cleanup. Just gonna put stuff away. Shop's kind of a mess. I like to do this every few days and just start from a clean slate. I really should do it more, but part of the problem is storage space. I just don't have enough space to put everything, so it ends up on benches and in various places. Yeah, so I have a ton of paperwork for this car, installation manuals and, everything else. So I generally like to keep all of these things in this binder. And then, that way, if I have any questions about manuals or documents, I can go right here instead of having to try and find it online. Although sometimes it is easier just to look it up on my phone when I'm on the car, and you'll see me do that quite frequently. often found that the best way to get something off the bench is to put it on the car. So I've got these two little bar mounts for when I build my switch box, and to just get them off the bench, let's put them on the car somewhere. that the shop's back in a somewhat clean state, let's get back to laying out these wires. So I'm just kind of getting these roughed out to where the sensor is going to be. I do know that the sensor ground and the sensor plus 5-volt wires are going to need to get broken out, and I'm going to need to run ground and power to each sensor. Yeah, so what I'm about to do here is I'm just pulling off the stock oil pressure sensor. I'm not going to need it. I got a electrical one coming in. And then what I'm doing is I'm just comparing the threads on one of my new pressure transducers to the original oil pressure sensor, and just figuring out what size I'm going to need for if I need to step up when I put the new pressure sensor on in the stock location. And as it turns out, it'll work just fine. So the stock pressure transducer is the same thread as the original one was. one thing that I need to do is I need to run ground and power to some of these sensors, and there's a single ground and power coming into the engine bay. So what I'm doing here is I'm just chopping one of the old wires, stripping them, kind of twisting them together, and I'm trying to see if 2 wires will fit under a single boot and then fit into the sensor connector, and it just doesn't. It's not going to work. So I need to split the 1 sensor wire into 6 and then run it to all the sensors. So I'm just trying to figure out where I'm going to put all these sensors. I've got that plug that's in one of the potential ports. I've got the sensor port on the right side. I've got the pressure transducers kind of sitting in it. And I think right now what I'm doing is I'm actually looking up a 1/4 inch NPT to 1/8 inch NPT fitting. And then I think that might even be 3/8 NPT in the head. So I'm just looking to see if I can get the fittings that are needed to make this all work. I was also looking to see if I can find a -8 AN orb with fuel pressure fitting, so that I can run the -8 orb and then have the fuel pressure sensor right in the same fitting. I was able to get one. You'll see this in a later video, but I did get it. So I've been, getting these wires kind of to length, and this is one of those moments where it's very nerve-wracking because I'm about to cut this wire, and if I have to redo it, it's not a huge deal in this case, considering it's just coming from the engine connector. Just be depinning it and then throwing another connector on there, but it's still a little nerve-wracking. So I just made sure I took my time and did it right, and I was happy with how it came out. So what I'm doing here is I'm just making sure that the intake air temperature sensor connector will be able to fit onto the sensor with the intake on, considering how close to the firewall it is. And yeah, it fit on no problem, so I got enough clearance that when the wires are on there, it shouldn't be a problem either. So something happened. Either the video got corrupted on the GoPro, or while I was transferring it over to the computer, one video was corrupted and just doesn't work. But during that time, I was building a 6-pin connector for the pressure transducer. And the reason why I was building a 6-pin connector is because I did not have a 4-pin at the time. So I've got a couple on order now. They'll be here in a couple weeks from now, which is start of the new year. So you won't see this for, few weeks, but yeah, so I'm just building it out with the 6-pin just because it's what I have and it'll work, and the pins will just transfer over into the 4-pin no problem. So those two wires may look familiar. They are the leftovers of what I cut off earlier. So I'm just using the leftover ground and power and pinning them up, and I can put them into the connector. So that crimper right there is a special Deutsch crimper, so that allows me to crimp the solid connectors on the Deutsch connectors, both the HD30, which you saw me use this on before. Maybe I talked about it, maybe I didn't, but it's also used on the DT, DTM, and DTP connectors. So what I do is I can set the depth for the pin, and then I can crimp it on the wire. Real nice unit. I really like working with the Deutsch stuff. So this right here is just something that, you know, I have to do in the shop. Is I get some parts and pieces in and I got to put them away. So what I got here are some 4-gauge lug terminals, and I am just gonna put them away in my bin. I cut the part number off so I can kind of have reference to it if I ever need to restock. You know, this is the boring stuff, but it's part of building a car, so I'm showing you some of the boring stuff as well. Alright, so we're done on the engine bay wiring for now, and we are going to move back to the electrical panel. And so when I first did those crimps, they were not good. They were very ugly. They had these massive wings on them. So I'm just trying to get them off, and it's very, very difficult to get them off. So I'm using a chisel and a hammer, and I'm just going to go over to my bench and put it in the vise and try and get this separated. So one of the good things is I know it was gonna hold, but as I say, it just looked super ugly. The crimping was not nice at all. So it's better to just take this off and redo it. Alright, so we're pulling up the big hydraulic crimper again, and we are going to put a new end onto this cable, and hopefully it looks a lot better than the old one did. I mean, it'd be hard to look worse. Yep, so I wasn't happy with that crimp, so we're going to pull it off, and this time I don't feel like doing a chisel. We're just going to bring out the cutting wheel, and we're just going to make this quick and easy. But I messed up the cable. I got a little too lazy and too quick, and I kind of cut the cable short, so I'm gonna start fresh. So I found a little tip online for cutting the sheathing off this wire, and that's if you use like a tubing cutter, like I have on the plate there. It actually allows you to get a really nice cut. It's nice and straight. You can adjust the depth as you're going so you're not marking the wire. I thought it was actually a pretty brilliant idea. So I just crimped that new end and I'm not happy with it. The crimp did not stay on. So obviously that die was not small enough to crimp the end and make it hold. So I'm going back to the original die and I'm gonna re-crimp and see if that holds. But having to crimp everything twice is not really enjoyable. This crimper is kind of big and heavy, and just the fact you have to change the dies, it's just not, you know, a good solution. So I just threw a couple of the mounting screws into the relay board just to make sure that I have a solid location as to where I need to cut this wire and strip it back to. And now my cutter's kind of gone sideways on me, so I'm gonna spend a little bit of time, dick around with it, try and fix it. At the end of the day, this is just a super old tool. The cutting wheel's not even that new or not that sharp anymore. I really should just get a new one, but it's what I got for the moment. As is usually the case with a bunch of messing around, we got it done. We got that wire on there, terminated nicely. Very happy with it. So now we're going to work on getting that terminal strip permanently mounted, and that's where the inputs for the relay board are going to go, and where some of the fan wires and other things are going to connect to as well. God, look at all that cardboard just sitting there. Let me tell you, if you're gonna build a race car, I really hope that you have excellent cardboard collection, because I cleaned that box out and then a week later it's just full again. It's like every day there's more parts and more cardboard and more, just more. Yeah, so we got that mounted. I'm very happy with it. Wiring's neat, wiring's clean, no complaints. Alright, so we are going to jump in the car and we are going to grind off those 2 tabs that I had in there. I'd only tacked them on because I kind of figured they weren't going to stay. You know, if I ever want to put a dash harness in there, which or a seatbelt harness in there, which I will, those can't be there. That's exactly where the seatbelt's going to mount to the seat bar. So pull those out, and I'll have to fab something out so that the plate is just, you know, off the bar an inch or so. But with those tabs out, let's just clean up the weld, and I'm going to start marking out on this board where I want them. So I think I end up being like equal distance. I think I measure it, and then I make sure that the tabs are in the same place. Or no, I guess it's not equal distance. I guess I just put them the same distance from the end on both sides. That's perfectly fine too, nothing wrong with that. Mark the hole, drill the hole. You know the deal. I've seen me do this stuff before. So we are going to get the welder all set up to weld this new plate onto the car. So those 2 tabs are going to mount to the bulkhead that would have held the rear seats, but there's not going to be a rear seat in this car, so we have all that space to put fun stuff like the electrical. So I'm just making a couple of marks on the floor there, and that's so I know where to grind. I need to get clean metal so I can weld this in, and yeah, that's all those marks are for. Yeah, I am pretty happy with how that's fitting, so let's weld this in. since I was only doing little tacks, I wasn't too worried about the plastic that's on the backing there. I probably should have removed it because it probably melted a little bit, but at the end of the day it didn't catch on fire, so we're okay. So let's just do a little bit of cleanup here. Now that the plate's back in the car, it's held in well enough. It's kind of floppy at the top, but that's fine. I'll have to figure out a better way to mount the top to the harness bar or one of the triangulation bars later. For now and for what we're doing, it's totally fine. But yeah, so we're just gonna put everything back on this board. So the relay board, I think I had it off. That little terminal strip, put it back on. Let's put the fuse box on, let's put the dominator on. Let's see how this all looks. I don't actually have the holes in that plate for the fuse box. I can't really do too much there, but I can start by, organizing some of the wires and getting back into some of the wiring on the car. So we're cutting a bunch of the zip ties out and we are getting that bundle loosened up. Let's see, what are we gonna do? I don't even remember. So if I recall correctly, those are all of the coil trigger wires that I pulled out of the dominator harness. And so I think I'm going to put those back into the main connector since I have the engine harness done and back in the car now. It makes kind of the most sense to put those back in. So on my phone there, I've got the Holy Dominator wiring up because I need to know where each coil wire plugs into each plug. Now that those are back in, we can get back to doing some of the other wiring on the car. Yeah, it looks like I just taped that bundle together just to kind of get it in place. Which wires need to go where and kind of figuring out what I'm going to do next. So what I'm realizing there is that those coil wires are real short and don't fit with the loop that I have for the rest of the harness. So I need to pull them back a little bit from either end and get more slack at the back end of this. So I'm just taping up the ignition wires, just get those kind of situated. got those wires pulled back, I can kind of start taping up this harness from the back to the front. Those are all of the trigger wires for my switch panel, and those are going to trigger the relays so I can manually turn them on. You know, even today, you know, after I've continued working on the wiring in this car, you know, for another 5 to 7 weeks, there's still so much to do. And if it turns out half as good as I want it to, it'll be pretty nice, I think. But it's going to be a long road to get there. I think, you know, I'm going to be in the ballpark of 120, 160 hours total in wiring on this car, probably by the time it's fully done and running. Long process, but you know, doing it right and doing it for the first time is an experience and eye-opening. So let's just get some of these wires organized. As always, more organizing, more moving, more shuffling around. And we are going to start getting this fuse box mounted up. So I'm making sure it's more or less centered on the board, and I'm using a clamp just to hold it in place while I mark where I'm going to drill. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up my vacuum. And I'm doing that so that as I'm drilling out this aluminum plate, the drill's going to catch most of the shavings, is my hope. I don't want a metal shaving to fall down between the wires and, you know, as the car is vibrating, like rub through and cause a short. So do my best to keep stuff clean while we're working with, you know, live wires. What we're doing is we're starting to lay out, figure out where some of these wires are going to go. We know that some of these outputs have to go to the relay board. We know that some of these inputs are going to have to go to that terminal block. So just kind of start getting it laid out. I'm just, for the most part, procrastinating, I guess, but also doing some work at the same time. It's a fine line I'm walking. so we're trying to figure out where it's going to be best to put these two little power strips. So that's where the ignition and crank is going to run into, and then where battery power is going to run into. And those are going to distribute power to various circuits. So just trying to, plan this out for the future. Yep, since I haven't really decided where those are going to go, I'm just going to start bundling up these wires and making them a little bit more organized and neat so that I can run them to their final destinations. decided I need to get the horn and the line lock wiring figured out because I need these to work. So I got it all figured out this time. I labeled it, so there's one ground input, the horn goes to one of the wires coming out, and then the button that I'm going to use for line lock will be the other output. I think the contacts in the steering wheel are just kind of old and not great, so that may be why I wasn't getting a solid result the first time around, but we got her this time. It's all good. Well, here's a pretty familiar sight. I'm cutting out zip ties and I'm pulling out some wiring. Yeah, so just more wiring. So this time I'm pulling out those 3 yellow wires that I had originally run for the line lock. I forget why I'm pulling it out, but I am. Well, that's all that we have gotten done in this week. As always, if you have stuck around this long, I'd like to thank you for viewing, and we'll catch you in the next one.